everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
And WPR associate editor Prachi Vidwans. Hi, Prachi.
Hey, Judah.
We'll be talking about what the second phase of the coronavirus pandemic will look like as China lifts the strict confinement measures that had been imposed on Wuhan since January, and several countries in Europe begin to consider exit strategies. What can we expect in the weeks and months ahead? Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Dan Gardner about how societies respond to catastrophes and why the popular expectation of a breakdown in social order is not borne out by the historical record. Freddy, Prachi, we've seen China lift the draconian lockdown on Wuhan this week, and now countries like Austria and the Czech Republic in Europe have announced that they would begin reopening non-essential shops and commerce next week. And at the same time, there's been a leveling off of new cases in France, Spain, and the UK, and of deaths in Italy. So it seems that the major hotspots in Europe will be emerging from this initial phase of the pandemic soon as well. Obviously, the US is a little behind on that curve, but still there's some reason for optimism in terms of some of the modeling that's going on in light of the social distancing measures. So Freddy, it might be premature to speak of the end of the beginning, but is it safe to say we're seeing the beginning of the end of the beginning?
It seems, at least on the one hand, that we may be past an initial first phase of the pandemic. We're no longer, looking at governments trying to dispute facts or not take the threat of COVID-19 seriously. So I think in that sense, we're over that stage. It does feel like, however, at least in the U.S., we're kind of back to a situation that played out a few weeks ago with Donald Trump and other members of his administration clearly itching to lift the restrictions. They agreed to keep them in place through the month of April, but, as some of the modeling has revised the death toll down slightly, although, again, that should be a good sign, because if, in fact, those numbers bear out, it means that social distancing and other measures are, in fact, working. But now there's, again, this itch to loosen the restrictions, and I wouldn't be surprised if Trump, again, rolls out the cure can't be worse than the problem, which he was saying a few weeks ago, suggesting that he wanted Americans back, filling church pews on Easter, which would be this Sunday. But it does seem like, on the one hand, yes, with governments taking it more seriously, and certain countries that haven't seen, the full devastation of places like Italy or Spain, governments do have the ability to think about reopening things and at least allow some activity again. But I do worry that there's the risk that could be premature. And, in the U.S. as well, there are warnings that even if the numbers might be potentially trending down in New York, they're trending up in other places like New Orleans and other cities. There are signs, too, that rural America is only just beginning to see the impact of the coronavirus. So I think that while we can look at things in stages with a pandemic like this, the timeline is not static by any means.
It's not static, and it's not uniform either across countries or within countries, as you pointed out. It's a good point you made, because it's almost hard to imagine that this time last month, there still was disputing going on in terms of what we were seeing and whether it would be a major event or not, let alone 6 weeks ago. And I know for myself, it feels like in the past month or so, I've absorbed so much information in terms of what to look for in terms of epidemiological modeling and flattening the curve, and on a personal level, the personal safety aspects of social distancing, and on a professional level, how we're covering this global story and this global historical event. And yet it's clear now that initial sort of rush to become, if not an expert, as informed as possible, is really pretty applicable to this first stage. and that as things evolve and develop in terms of this crisis, we're going to have to do the same process, but regarding different aspects of the crisis as it unfolds over the course of the next year to year and a half, or until there's an effective treatment or vaccine. One thing I'm curious about, Prachi, in terms of just your imagination, your expectations. What does the return to, if not normal, the unlocking of these restrictions look like? In Wuhan, I saw a video of the first day after the restrictions were lifted, and you saw masses of people flocking to these crowded train stations because they wanted to leave and go visit family elsewhere. It was the first time they could leave the city. And it just struck me as I was really surprised, because I expected that after this kind of event, people would be slow to take back, to get comfortable with being that close to other people, especially that many other people. So, I mean, what do you think when restrictions are lifted? Are restaurants going to be packed? Restaurants and bars? Is it going to be that kind of celebration? Or will some of these social distancing measures or habits, will they linger? Will people try stop avoiding proximity with passersby, or will they still veer around them to leave 6 feet? I mean, what's your expectation on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think in Wuhan, what we're seeing is a reaction to the trauma of the lockdown from when it was first imposed. The lockdown went into effect pretty rapidly, following weeks of the Chinese Communist Party denying that there was even a problem. So even when the lockdown was first imposed, you saw many, many people trying to leave, including, travelers taking fever suppressants and trying to desperately get out while they could. So I think to some extent, I wonder if the rush to leave Wuhan now is a reflection of that. But I think around the world, it's likely that people will want to rebound from social isolation by reaching out to others again. I think that's a pretty normal reaction. Whether that's advisable is a separate question, I think. Dr. Fauci just recently said that there are some measures that we should stick with, even after social distancing measures are lifted. I think Dr. Fauci recently said, I don't think we should ever shake hands again. I think some of these measures would help us prevent the spread of other diseases like influenza, which has been pretty devastating this year separately from the coronavirus. He mentioned that, this is a quote from him as well, "It isn't like a light switch on and off. It's a gradual pulling back on certain of the restrictions and to try and get society a bit back to normal." So I think even if our impulse is to reach out to others again, it would probably make more sense to keep social distancing to some extent. Of course, if we're looking at this crisis lasting 18 months, that's a lot to ask of any group of people.
It's a fascinating point, the way in which social practices can be changed by an event like this. And who knows, maybe 10, 20 years, 30 years from now, we'll be forced to explain to the next generation why people used to shake hands and what happened to stop us from doing that, and why older people still kind of might have a reflex to reach their hand out to you when they come to meet you for the first time. Freddy, do you have any expectations for what it's going to look like when in that first period when restrictions are lifted?
Well, I think that the point about handshaking is just a reminder that I think it'll probably play out in ways that, on the one hand, you can look at a couple, predictions or expectations, but then a lot of other things will be very unexpected. I think the idea that, very ingrained social practice, whether it's handshaking or, people giving each other hugs or, air kisses, in different parts of Europe, that, maybe that will go away as well. I think that like the initial period, once restrictions are eased, I still think it's going to come up against the reality of just the social impact of the pandemic. I mean, in the U.S. at least, even if the federal government at the end of April issues some new guidelines that are slightly more relaxed, the state level restrictions will probably remain in place in many states. If anything, they'll probably be increasing in states where, the virus has only spread more recently. And I also think that even if in a place like New York or something where if the trend lines bear out and the virus is on its way down, at least for the moment, people are still going to be nervous about interacting and going into stores and restaurants and other places. So I do think that there's still this, and this will be true of many places, that, the authorities, whether they're local or state or federal, might issue whatever guidance they have. But I do think it's going to be a longer time frame in terms of people themselves feeling comfortable going out and sort of resuming normal life, as it were. And I think that that's the issue that, at least in the sort of political messaging that we see from Trump, is trying to ignore or deny that, Trump is already signaling, he wants the economy to boom back once they can reopen, because he's mainly interested in the impact that, this sudden economic recession is going to have on his reelection chances. But I don't think that the idea that, if they told all Americans by the end of the month that the worst is over, you can go back to life as normal, the worst will not be over, at least in parts of the country, presumably. But also, even if it is, people are still going to have this ingrained sense of insecurity and worry. And, again, to go back to Fauci and other experts, they've warned that, the pandemic, the virus will come in waves. So there could be another wave in the fall. So, people are going to keep that in mind, and that even if a vaccine is not ready until sometime early next year at the earliest, there could be another, reemergence of the virus in the winter. So I do think that, people are going to have to be prepared for a much longer time frame, even if in the shorter term, the worst of the last few weeks may pass.
Prachi, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, Freddy, what your comments brought to mind something that was in a recent WPR article where one of our writers mentioned that it might be a challenge to maintain political will as the months continue. So this writer was speaking specifically about the stimulus package in the U.S. that, right now perhaps politicians are able to come together around it was still quite fraught, but they were able to pass a deal to address some of the economic problems that the coronavirus has brought, but that if there's another stimulus package needed in the fall, that political will might not be there. And I wonder if this challenge will extend to other areas as well. This week with the election in Wisconsin, we've already seen some partisan bickering about how to carry out an election during a pandemic. So I think that perhaps as the months go on, we might see greater division, which would be the last thing that we need.
Both of those points kind of feed into something that I was going to say, which is that I think if psychologically I feel like we're at again, not the end of the beginning, but at least a point where we can look forward to the next phase of the crisis, is that it seems like all other things being equal, and if the social distancing measures are maintained, that at least one thing, the uncertainty has been lifted about the scale of what's ahead for us and what's going to hit us in terms of the public health crisis. A month ago, as you said, Freddie, there were still disputes about what was ahead for us, and there was wide variations in the modeling, and there was a lot of uncertainty about whether we would even institute social distancing in various countries. So at that point, there was this real sense of anxiety, fear, the impending doom about the scale of what might await us. I don't think we've become inured to what's going on, but I think in terms of the numbers and the scale, we're more used to it, and we've calibrated to that. And so I think that for me, at least psychologically, I'm looking ahead. I feel like if the wave hasn't necessarily passed us by, there's a moment to look ahead at the next waves that might be on their way. And I think that Prachi, that your point is well taken. That now it's really the economic impact that's come into the spotlight, and it raises these new questions of sustainability of political will, but also sustainability on a financial level, and the uncertainty of what the actual scale of the economic impact will be. And so I think the uncertainty has sort of shifted now. And then you get into this question of if there's a need for periodic shutdowns, whether this experience that we've had now will make them easier to get people to comply with quickly. But there's also the sort of political choice of how high is the needle? Is it acceptable to let the needle rise in terms of the public health crisis in order to try to mitigate the economic impact? And where is the public health system sustainable? Where is the political leadership and public opinion comfortable putting that needle in terms of the need for sort of hitting the brakes, as they say, in terms of periodic shutdowns? And I think that's a few of the questions that we're going to have to start examining more closely in this period coming up.
Yeah, I think that, just on a very practical level, any move to ease restrictions, whether that's in the U.S. or other parts of Europe, other countries that have been hit hardest by the coronavirus, what's really central still is what was the first failure here in the U.S. and in other countries of testing, and that there still isn't adequate testing in terms of really understanding the scale of infections and cases and how it looks, on a city, local, state, regional level. And until you can get to that level of testing, I don't think governments are going to be able to, reassure people that it's okay to go back to work, or it's okay for a select group of people who have not gotten sick to go back to work, because there's still this unknown about how the virus is spreading, or whether it is in fact going down, or what its true scope looks like, because the testing, as much as, there's been an effort to ramp it up here in the U.S., it's still lagging behind. And there are still lots of stories of states, even ones that have been provided, new, faster testing that's been rapidly developed by private labs, that's still, in terms of capacity, extremely low and not meeting the real demands. And that the only countries really that I think have shown a way that people can go back to work and sort of mitigate the effects of these shutdowns, countries like Singapore, Taiwan, I think to another extent, they've been able to institute testing on a huge scale, partly because of their smaller size, and then also been able to basically monitor people much more closely than you could in a country like the U.S., just given its size and just given the dynamics between state governments and the federal government. So I still think that, at least in the U.S., the lack of testing is still going to be the X factor that limits how much, even easing restrictions, how much impact they really have, because people are not going to feel comfortable knowing, what the full scale of the pandemic looks like. And I still think that that's really going to be the underlying story of this, in the U.S. at least, that the full scale of COVID-19 was never really known.
There's also still a lot of remaining questions about the behavior of the virus, and whether immunity is developed, whether people can recontract the disease, or whether it reactivates. I'm seeing some reporting now. So all those questions, in addition to the actual testing of who has it or has had it, are all add to that the uncertainty in terms of ability to lift the lockdowns. Prachi, you mentioned the question of voting, and also obliquely in terms of the way in which China locked down Wuhan so suddenly and abruptly, and in such an authoritarian manner. And we've seen a lot of debate over the past month or so about democracies versus authoritarian regimes in terms of how they handled the initial phase of the crisis. I don't think either. I think there's some successful reactions among democracies, some among authoritarian countries, and vice versa in terms of unsuccessful reactions across the board. Looking forward, though, to this period of when there might be the need for periodic shutdowns. Again, assuming all these uncertainties that we have about testing and the disease are cleared up, do you have a suspicion about whether democracies versus authoritarian regimes, which would be in a better position to sustain public buy-in to that kind of procedure where the shutdown is lifted for a month and then the spread of the disease goes up enough that it has to be reinstated? Do you have any sort of suspicion about which regime is better suited to sustain that kind of public buy-in over that long a period of time?
Yeah, what your question and Freddy's comments as well bring up for me is this question of public opinion and government legitimacy. So in the months to come, in a democratic country, if a democratic country needs to implement social distancing again or implement another lockdown, the challenge will be getting public buy-in for that move. And I think what we saw in this first phase is that they only received that public buy-in, or politicians only felt pressured to implement a lockdown when the situation became so bad that the need for extreme measures was undeniable. So I think going forward, ideally a democracy would implement a lockdown or social distancing measures if needed before we get to that point. And I think it puts Democrats in an interesting position. You know, if a Democratic leader implements a lockdown well before the situation worsens, then people might say that they acted prematurely and that, you know, things weren't that bad, they didn't get that bad, so why do you need to lock down? If they wait too long, they'll be criticized for failing to act early. So it puts them in kind of a difficult position. So I think in democracies, the best case scenario is that they listen to the advice of scientists on when these lockdown measures are necessary. In authoritarian countries, I think the situation is quite different because, you know, I've heard it said that no one fears the people like an authoritarian does, because authoritarians don't necessarily have a good read on what public opinion really is. So I think that there's a fear among authoritarians of festering anger that they don't really have that they don't really have their finger on the pulse. I think in thinking about China, after when lockdown measures were finally implemented and travel bans were finally instated, that was around the time when Li Wenliang, the whistleblower doctor from Wuhan, died. And there was this huge surge of criticism on Weibo and WeChat, and that hadn't really been seen before that point. And it seemed like some Chinese citizens were willing to voice dissent at unprecedented levels. And that was followed by a crackdown and censorship. But you kind of wonder what happened to that anger. Is it still there? And at that time, there was also some question of whether, you know, maybe this anger wouldn't lead to the end of the Chinese Communist Party's reign over China, but perhaps it could mean that Xi Jinping, his leadership of the party, is in danger. So it's interesting. On the other hand, since then, we've seen Chinese propaganda be really successful in changing the narrative about authoritarians being able to respond to a crisis better than democracies. And so I think it's going to be a war of words, and to what extent that propaganda is effective in changing minds of Chinese citizens within China.
In some ways, it's like a political parallel to the actual disease. There's all these asymptomatic cases that are sort of invisible. And in an authoritarian country like China, there's all these, there's a lot of silent opposition that's invisible, but that you never know when it might break into public view in terms of coalescing into some sort of grievance against the government. I guess that also gets us to this question of accounting and accountability, both domestic and international. in terms of how governments and leaders handled the outbreak. Freddy, do you think that in democracies, for instance, or authoritarian governments as well, because as Prachi pointed out, even if the CCP remains in power, it could weaken Xi's grip on it, and might even lead to the end of his rule if he's seen as being responsible for some sort of massive failure that the Chinese people associate with him. Do you think that leaders are going to pay for the ways they succeeded, or rather pay for the way they failed and benefit from the ways they succeeded in the case of someone like Angela Merkel, for instance, in responding to the outbreak? Or do you think that there's a rally around the flag effect and it's the sort of thing where people say no one could have necessarily done better?
I think sort of in most, I guess, quote unquote, normal political contexts, in any kind of national crisis, a capable enough leader will benefit, just because it's natural that there is often this sort of rally around the flag effect. And also, if you do have a leader who's, on people's TVs every day, giving them updates and at least projecting an air of competence, many leaders do benefit. And I think that in a lot of countries you're seeing that. In the U.S., on a state level, you're seeing that. Polling for governors like Andrew Cuomo and Gavin Newsom and Jay Inslee in Washington, and a bunch of governors that have been on the front line of dealing with the outbreak, have something like 70, even 80% approval ratings. We saw with Trump, it was a different story, that he did get a little bit of a bump initially, but now those numbers are going back down. And I do think that the U.S. is not normal in that case. And I think that we're already seeing the political cost to what is increasingly looking like a failed government response by the Trump administration. It seems like every day this week there's been new reporting about an early warning, whether from the intelligence community or someone within the administration, in late January or even back in November, raising the alarm about the emergence of a virus in China that was going to pose the risk of a global pandemic. I think in that case, the risk could have a deeper political impact. I mean, it's unique because it's an election year. I mean, I think in terms of long-term accountability, whether in the U.S. or in the U.K., I imagine that it will sort of unfold like the 9/11 Commission or the investigations into the Iraq War, where it will be very extensive, but it will come many years after the fact. And it will sort of be a, proof that democratic societies can, in fact, hold leaders accountable. It just is a question of the leaders might be out of office at that point. They might have been voted out already, or their terms might have been up. So it's more of a sort of an exercise of accountability rather than holding those specific leaders to account themselves.
In some ways, though, the example of Cuomo is sort of a good one in terms of the complexity of the question, because he has also been faulted for mishandling the actual initial outbreak in New York State, along with Mayor de Blasio in New York City. But then following that initial maybe belated response, he really stepped up and has been a real model of public communication and transparency and leadership. So it could also be it could be complicated by the actual particular cases of the individual leaders and whether or not they were perceived to go on to make up for an initial failure, for instance. Prachi, getting to the international level, we've also seen, and you mentioned the Chinese propaganda kicking into effect. We've seen that the pandemic has become yet another arena for competition between the U.S. and China in terms of trying to lay blame to begin with, but also China laying claim to being a provider of public goods, in this case humanitarian assistance and medical assistance to countries that have become hotspots, whereas the U.S. has really been absent in terms of any sort of international response. Do you see? Do you think that sort of the outcome of the international accounting and accountability is now decisively shaped and formed, or do you think it's still similar to what Freddy said in terms of domestic accountability? Will there be a chance later to add information and change people's perception of how both countries have done in terms of global leadership?
I think that there is still time. I think in what seems like it's going to be quite a long crisis, we're still in the early stages. So I don't think that this story is over. But I think in order to change the narrative that exists right now, the United States and other Western democracies will need to work together far better than they have been so far. And additionally, we're still going to see this crisis unfolds in developing countries, and that's where aid is really going to come into question. So once the U.S. passes the peak and flattens the curve, will our leaders then turn around and offer supplies to other countries? Honestly, it seems doubtful right now, but a move like that could change the narrative and reestablish U.S. leadership on the global stage.
Great point. Freddy, any thoughts on that or anything else before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to imagine in the current moment, given who's in the White House, that if the worst of this passes in the U.S., that the U.S. would necessarily then pivot to its traditional role of helping the world out in a global crisis, just because Trump has been trying to dismantle that notion since he was elected. I do think that other countries, mainly European countries and others, that have aspirations within the UN and within other parts of the multilateral system, could try to fill the vacuum. But at the same time, we've been talking about that for the last couple of years now. And while there have been a few examples, Emmanuel Macron in France, for example, they're a little bit more visible, but the impact has still been limited because they're not the United States ultimately, and they don't have the power and economic power and otherwise of the U.S. So I do think that until the U.S. can really step up and play the role that it traditionally has, there's going to be a leadership vacuum internationally, and that's not going to happen while Trump is president, I don't think.
I agree with both of your points. I think that especially in the long crisis that this is likely to be, a collective response and coordination is going to be essential, because otherwise the virus will just be ping-ponged back and forth from one hotspot to another. And that, yes, the Trump administration, it's just not in its DNA to provide that kind of leadership. It's an administration that's obviously very hostile to that role and to the multilateral institutions and forums where it could be played. So the question, I guess, then ends up, will that leadership vacuum be filled by China, and will people see, will people have a nuanced appreciation of that? Will they be skeptical of it, or will they join the bandwagon to the permanent detriment of the United States in that role? Again, all issues and questions that remain to be seen, and then I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss in the future. All right, time to get to some WPR articles we want to mention for everyone. Freddy, which did you want to flag?
Well, sticking with coronavirus coverage, a piece by Jan Werner Mueller, who's an expert on populism, on why predictions that COVID-19 will seriously harm the political fortunes of populists, as some are suggesting, or even make populism the pandemic's first ideological casualty, are premature.
And Prachi?
Sure. I want to flag a feature by Alex Evans and David Stephen, which is called Building Trust, Confidence, and Collective Action in the Age of COVID-19. So this is a follow-up to a previous feature that they wrote, and they explore ways that anyone, from an individual to a business to a world leader, can implement measures to improve global cooperation at a time when it's so depreciated.
And I'll mention Stuart Patrick's column on why the response to the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to frustrate efforts to address the climate crisis once the pandemic is behind us. It's become commonplace to read about declines in air pollution and carbon emissions during the economic shutdowns currently in place around the world. Stewart calls these effects a mirage of what a low-carbon footprint world would look like. But the reality is that in the aftermath of the pandemic, governments around the world will likely be eager to boost economic recovery at the expense of efforts to address climate change. A little bit of a pessimistic note to end there. I have had this feeling of nostalgia for 2-3 months ago when the only major crisis we had to worry about was an existential climate crisis that was at least in the best of circumstances 30 to 50 years away from really becoming acute. All right, 2 things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. You'll get free access to selected WPR articles all week long, as well as a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. Again, the URL is wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Freddy, why don't you kick things off?
I can tell you personal attacks that have been going on for more than 2-3 months. Abuses or racist comments, giving me names. I don't care, to be honest. Even death threats. I don't give a damn.
I know who this is. Prachi, do you know?
Maybe Dr. Fauci. I know he's been receiving threats.
I'm going to say I can't remember his name offhand, but it's the head of the WHO.
It is. Tedros Ghebreyesus, if I'm pronouncing that right. Ghebreyesus. He was responding to a question specifically about Trump's threat to cut off U.S. funding to the WHO, which he framed as basically retaliation for the WHO in his mind being too pro-China. And the head of the WHO didn't answer that directly, but instead went and divulged all the other personal attacks he's apparently been getting during the pandemic.
And Prachi, what do you got?
Okay, here it is. You will be pleased to know that we do consider both the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny to be essential workers.
I know this one too.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I know. I think I know it too. Is it?
Go ahead.
The Jacinda Ardern?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Good job.
The Prime Minister of New Zealand.
Yeah, she continued by asking children to be understanding if the Easter Bunny couldn't visit them this year because it's a bit difficult under the circumstances.
She's got a good touch in terms of her public communication.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, probably the kind of leader who is definitely getting higher approval ratings for her handling of this crisis.
Yeah. All right, here goes mine. Correct answer is if you know who it's about. I don't expect you to know who actually said it. Here's the quote. Things are getting better for him. He's stable, improving, sat up, and engaged with medical staff.
Is it Boris Johnson?
It is. Well done. The British Prime Minister, who was hospitalized Monday and subsequently placed in intensive care after having contracted the coronavirus 10 days before. I have to say it's hard to imagine Boris Johnson, who is known for liking the sound of his own voice and being quite a talker. It's hard to imagine him intubated and unable to speak and in ICU. So it's good to hear he's getting better. All right. Great stuff. Thanks, Freddy.
Thanks, Judah.
Thanks, Prachi.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. You'll get free access to selected WPR articles all week long and a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.